Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this weird, turbulent, fast forward, problematic pandemic planet. We're going to figure out how to tell stories more effectively. This is round two, season two, week two of the Thriving Online seminars we started on my Sustain What experiment. And all of this is an experiment. 3 months old, 50 or so sessions. And the whole idea is, how do you make information matter in a very noisy world and with a lot of confusion? Just this morning, we had the World Health Organization is holding an inaugural 2-week symposium of a lot of experts getting together on, do we need the field of infodemiology, like infodemic, just like we have epidemiology? And I think the answer is a big yes. And even while you do all that thumb sucking and analyzing data, we have to talk to people like Randy Olson, who's here with me today, and who I've known for quite a long while. Randy, you can unmute now. Who's just been surfing this morning. He lives in Malibu, where he learned about wildfire risk in a big way a couple of years ago. But I came across Randy, I don't know, gosh, way long ago when I was doing .earth, my blog at the New York Times. And here was this guy who had been a marine biologist and who then went to film school and then did some really interesting films on climate change and on creationism. And now he's into helping people shape stories more effectively. And you're going to hear a lot about this in a few seconds. We're going to fast forward a little bit through how he approaches a question. And Randy, it's good to have you here. Are you in Malibu? Are you like on just a stone's throw from the beach? Where are you now?
Of course, I am a climate refugee. I got chased away for 4 months, moved to Santa Monica, and then couldn't resist. I had to move back here. But yeah, that's a whole nightmare story. What went on in the city of Malibu? It was devastated by the wildfires. Over 600 homes burned down. Before we even get started, I want to share one little thing for your benefit. Ever show you this picture? Look, can you see who that is?
Oh, a little bit, yeah. Wait, explain. Give me the caption.
Guess who those two characters
are?
Oh,
I know. It's one of my. Oh my God! It's the Will the Circle Be Unbroken folks, John McEwen and the gang from, I assume, is that right?
No, who's that in the middle?
I literally can't see. It's too small on my screen.
Oh shucks! It's a very young Steve Martin.
Oh my God!
And comedian? On the far side is a very young Jerry Garcia.
Jesus. And are you in that picture?
Oh, hell no.
Oh, shoot.
No, I'm too young.
Well, they're all good storytellers.
Yeah, tremendous.
Somebody robbed the Glenville train this morning at 9:30. You can learn a lot from songwriting. So let's get into this, though. Sure. I have some slides from you, and I don't want to waste time because we want to make sure we can engage with the audience that's watching. And I hope people who are watching can share this right now. Like, go to the link you're watching on and retweet it or re-Facebook it or do whatever you do with those links. And Randy offered some visual aids. You know, again, I came at this from storytelling being like, let's do a big magazine story on global warming in 1988. So we figured if you put a scary melting planet in the middle, that would be a way to get people's attention. 30 something years of doing that doesn't seem to work. So Randy, how do you make science matter?
We'll find out. Am I able to advance this thing?
You tell me and I'll do the clicking.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, we're going to have multiple clicks here. So
that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And thanks, everybody, for giving me a chance to share a few thoughts here today. Really appreciate the opportunity. This is the world we live in nowadays, as we know. Unfortunately, it's hard to propagate a lot of knowledge because different disciplines are so much caught up in individual silos with complete cultures. I, once upon a time, was deep into the academic science silo. I was a marine biology professor at the University of New Hampshire, achieved tenure there, but along the way, kind of developed this bigger, broader interest in mass communication of not just science, but information in general. And particularly, I was fascinated by what is it that Hollywood knows that obviously the academic world and the general public doesn't know as well, and how to promote these topics and light fires inside of people. So I got into filmmaking, wanted to be, the dream scenario was the combination science professor and filmmaker, but eventually it became clear that I couldn't really get to the depths of the cinema world without making it jump between silos. And that's what I did. So at age 38, I resigned from my tenure professorship, moved to Los Angeles, and you want to click that exactly. as we move along here. Went to film school at the University of Southern California, but from the very beginning going out there, I was in search of trying to answer this question of what did they know? And in some ways wondering, hoping that I could find just one good thing in Hollywood that I could bring back to the non-Hollywood world eventually someday. And I found it. Next click. It's called the ABT narrative template. I'll get into that in detail in a moment. I found it deep in the cinema world, in the cinema school, and also in the world of Hollywood. And clicking with each point of the finger as though I had a button I was punching. There you go. And as soon as I came to realize the power of this template, I began trying to share it with the world of communication and journalists in general, and really kind of hit a big brick wall there. So from there, went to clicking.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry. And then went back to the world that I had entree back into, at least a little bit, the world of science. And so for the last 10 years in particular, I've been working at trying to propagate this whole approach of the ABT framework. So if we can click on that, and where this originates from is it's something that I heard from a documentary on, of all places, Comedy Central, almost 10 years ago, about the making of the animated series South Park. So what I want to show you here is a 40-second clip that kind of sketches out these three words of and, but, and therefore, the origins of it. And this is a video that was on YouTube. Somebody else put together. This is just a 40-second excerpt from it. If you can click play on that, I hope we can all hear it. Ruh-roh. I'm not getting audio. Are you?
You're not? It should be there. Oh, you know what? I realized I think I might have not hit a little thing that could have put the audio there.
Let's just play and I'll talk it through.
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah.
Let me go back to sharing it.
Sure.
Folks, if you have questions or comments, you can start to bring them in. And sorry about my initial little screw up here. I forgot a little detail you have to do when you're doing these things. It's like here and here and share audio. There's a little arrow.
Oh, okay.
I do like StreamYard. And so here we go. Let's try it again.
Got to reset it. Yeah.
Has been so successful over the
years. Can you hear it now?
Not only because
you want to reset once more?
But because their episodes, South Park has been so successful over the years, not only because their episodes contain satire, but because their episodes contain proper story structure. The rule that Trey and Matt use in their writer's room is called the but, therefore rule.
We can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words and then belong between those beats, you're f***ed. Between every beat that you've written down is either the word therefore or but. Should be this happens and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. You get a show that feels like, okay, this to that, to this to that, but this, here's the complication to that.
Great.
Yeah.
Did it. Okay.
There you go.
Yes. So that was variation on what they talked about in the documentary. And when I heard it, I had been through film school. I'd had at least 5 writing courses, but I had never heard story structure described in such simple terms. And if there's one thing I knew from being a scientist, it's the power of simplicity. So I set to work researching where this all came from because it didn't really initiate with them. And what I did was found my way to,
whoops, sorry.
Okay, to this fellow, Frank Danielle, one of the all-time greatest screenwriting instructors. I was lucky enough to have his script analysis course the year before he passed away. He was a professor at USC. And in 1986, actually, there's a speech that we found, and you can hit that, in which in 2 paragraphs, he kind of laid out this whole dynamic of these 3 words. And what he said was monotony is a problem in first drafts. He was talking about screenwriting, but it really applies to all communication. There's several reasons for it. One usually is the fact that the scenes follow in the forbidden pattern of and then, exactly as Trey Parker was talking about there. Next slide. In a dramatic story, the pattern is usually, and what he means by a dramatic story is a story that draws on the power of narrative. Usually the pattern is for the connecting scenes is and, but, therefore, next. Boom, and one more. And these are the 3 words that come together that I pulled together out of their rule of replacing they talked about for South Park into a singular template, the ABT narrative template. And as we can see in the next slide, this is the template itself, and keep clicking there till we fill in all the 3 forces. because the template is much deeper than just the 3 words. It actually, the words are almost the tip of the iceberg. What they represent are the 3 fundamental forces of narrative. This is how we communicate all day long, not just in recent decades, but going back thousands of years, all the way back to the first recorded stories of Gilgamesh. We communicate basically through setup, contradiction, and consequence.
Yeah.
Next slide. And when you begin to absorb this and look in the world around you, you see wherever there's effective communication, the ABT is at work. So starting with one of the greatest speeches in everybody's list of the top 5 most important speeches in the history of this country is the Gettysburg Address. But when you look at it, you realize, wait a second, it's nothing more than just an ABT. There's 3 paragraphs and hit 3 times there. The first paragraph is basically, we are a great and mighty nation. The second paragraph is, but now we're engaged in a horrible civil war. Third paragraph, therefore it's up to us, the living, to make sure that these souls were not or did not die in vain. And there have been hundreds of essays and articles written about the enduring power and beauty of the Gettysburg Address, none of which point to this simple structure that it embodies. Ken Burns did an entire hour documentary on it, didn't make any mention at all. I promise you, this is the reason why this speech has endured more than anything else. Yes, there's beautiful prose in it. Yes, he says dedicate several times. Yes, he says the beautiful 7 years ago. But this is much deeper. This is narrative structure. This is the defining factor between whether things are boring or confusing and don't endure, or whether they're deeply engaging and lock in. And you see it everywhere you look. You see it in nursery rhymes. You see it in the structure of songs. You see it in novels, on and on and on. Next slide. And one wonderful place that you see it, that also, as far as I know, nobody's really gone to work detailing this, is on the front page of your old employer, the New York Times. So this last year, I was at Barnes & Noble. I've been kind of studying the front page for the last 5 years or so. And then having to look in the remainders bin and found this beautiful book for normally $75. They had it for $9.99. this tremendous, huge book that has a selection of front pages going all the way back to, okay. Suddenly I'm seeing comments on here.
Yeah. They'll be coming in more in a minute.
Okay. All right, good. And so this goes all the way back to the 1851, and it's mostly front pages of major historical events. But they give you like a little plastic magnifying glass to go with it, because the whole front page is there. It's all in this microscopic font. So next slide. I set to work. Okay. So here's what you see nowadays when you look at the front page of the New York Times. Is on the right, you see zoomed in, you invariably see 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 articles on the front page every single day that have this ABT form to them very, very clearly. Namely, that they have 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs of setup and NM material. Then they hit the but. And not only that, they hit it with what I call a but paragraph. It is, the paragraph begins with the word but. I began quantifying this, counting it. Turns out nowadays it averages about 2 but paragraphs per day. And this is being Mr. Narrative Nerd. Every time I go to my local grocery store, I buy the New York Times and sit there and count the but paragraphs. And it's like clockwork. But there's one example there that I think had 4 in that particular day. But next slide. But when you go back through the New York Times history, going back through that book, what you see is previous to 1900, there were never but paragraphs. There was almost never the word but. That's because back then it was all and, non-narrative. It was just what went on yesterday in New York City. There wasn't any attempt to put this stuff into the bigger global context.
Stenography, journalism by stenography. That's
what it was in the beginning. And I call this narrative selection because you see it over and over again. The world of science. Actually, Carl Zimmer had a nice article about a month ago in the New York Times about how the first science papers were. And it's exactly the same thing. In the 1600s, the very first scientific journals, it was all and. It was just stream of consciousness, a whole bunch of information. Over time, the ABT function in the brain begins to operate and demand that this stuff take on this form. That's what you see with the New York Times. By the 1920s, they began to allow writers to have their byline in that big fat book. Is a nice article by one of the reporters telling about the patterns that they see over time, but not nearly this analytical. And by the 20s, you began to see it. You began to see the first but paragraphs. Nowadays, average is about 2 per day, as I say, on the front page. So basically, it's been this evolutionary shift over time from the non-narrative and into the ABT structure of narrative. And next slide. Oh, okay. So that's and I've got yeah. So that's where I was in 2000. Well, we got a bit more to come on the slides.
Okay, we'll go back to it.
But, that's where I'd gotten to by 2015. I wrote a book called Houston we have a narrative, and
it's right back there somewhere. I should have had it out.
Wonderful. All right. University of Chicago Press. And sketched out in there the idea of a training program to help people begin to develop what I term narrative intuition. And that's a term I derive from the Hollywood screenwriters. What they talk about in Hollywood is story sense. This idea that you understand this narrative, these narrative powers at such a deep level that you can just feel them and you can feel what's wrong in content. So we began our Story Circles narrative training. I recruited a group of about probably 10 people that helped do it. We've ended up with over 5 years, about 25 or so organizations, and we've run 100 of the circles and about 50 or so demo days involved. Got more than 500 graduates. It was booming, doing just great. I was booked for all the rest of the year, but then we had this little problem of the pandemic, and that first off resulted in a wonderful vacation for me. I spent a month just surfing and playing tennis, and with all the travel canceled, it was great despite the horrors of the pandemic. And then after about a month in April, pulled the group together again, the 6 or 7 of us, and came up with this idea. Let's test the waters and see if we might be able to do an online version of this. Next slide, I think.
Hold on 1 second. I'll pull it back up.
So there you go. Put together this idea of an online course, announced it on Twitter on a Monday. By Friday, had filled all 50 slots, I think $100 a person. And the following Monday, launched it. And the rest has been 10 tons of fun. Really, really cool. Next slide. That was a little blog announcement of it. And here's where we are now. We ran the first 2 rounds open for anybody to sign up. Then word got out, Fish and Wildlife Service bought the 3rd round, which we just finished an hour ago with the 10th session on that. These are 10 1-hour sessions, kind of Monday, Wednesday, Friday. A week from today, we'll be launching the 4th round with National Park Service. In the meanwhile, my good buddy Park Howell in the business world, the host of The Business of Story, is part of our group. And then he and I put together a version for the business world, which we just finished last week, and they loved that. So we're now working on round 2 of that. So branching into the business world, because this ABT concept, this ABT framework is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And it's not just entertainment and Hollywood. It's not just the science world. It's not just the business world. It's the political world more than anything else, tragically, and on every single discipline it applies, because it's narrative, and narrative is the central core. And last little tweak to put on that is I am not teaching scientists how to tell stories. That's the easy handle that people tend to, the journalists, when they write something about the books. Oh, he's on a mission to teach scientists how to tell stories. No, I'm trying to draw on some of the knowledge they have from the world of story, from Hollywood, because they have been the pioneers for a century. They're the ones, I think in part because they had such a huge profit incentive, they're the ones that have really mastered this stuff. But it's knowledge like that ABT that has just sat there within Hollywood, and nobody's got that much incentive. You know, I mean, like Matt and Trey, the South Park guys, if I was them, I wouldn't try and go out and teach courses and stuff. I'd be having too much fun just making use of it. So that's kind of what I've been at. Is the core thing is the word narrative, and the way I define the word narrative in the Houston book, that all the humanities people, you know, want to vomit when they hear me talking about this, but I give it a very analytical definition, which is narrative is the series of events that occur in the search for the solution to a problem. And it means that this is all about problem solution stuff. And Jonathan Gottschall had a nice book about 10 years ago called Storytelling Animal. I would actually retitle that as Problem Solution Creature. And that's at the core of it all. So there you go.
That's a good start. I think the challenge for me sometimes in thinking about this is that everyone who's kind of in power already uses this, whether it's Trump or whether it's instinct. Well, wait. Let me just finish my thought. Advertising. Madison Avenue has known this forever. They're selling the narrative, not the car. So if our goal is to cut toward, you know, what you and I might agree are solutions to the big issues of saving coral reefs, or slowing climate change, or getting people to think more carefully about the value of vaccines, how do we deal with that bigger landscape where it's still kind of like a noise factor in here?
I think the starting point is just getting everybody, and absolutely everybody involved in a cause, to understand the simple divide between non-narrative and narrative. And you're never going to hold people's interests with non-narrative. Narrative is leadership, and exactly what you say. Every leader that's effective is effective with this, because people do not follow leaders who are boring or confusing. It's that simple. So The brain is programmed with this ABT dynamic. This is very clear. I wouldn't say it's that well documented because neurophysiologists are just getting started mapping this out. I think the one guy that's really made some solid progress on it is Yuri Hasson at Princeton. For 10 years, I've been citing his work, and he's done functional MRI on people watching material that does and doesn't have narrative structure to it. And it's that simple. It's this divide between, does it have narrative structure, meaning is it all built around a problem solution dynamic, or is it non-narrative where it's just information? And the tough part is that the real world is mostly non-narrative. It's mostly just and stuff. And so you get these artsy films that are wonderful. And the reason they're so wonderful is because they're and. And what that means is that they're a really accurate portrait of the real world. If you know that real world, you really can savor it and connect it. But the problem is the average person's brain is ABT programmed, and they just can't stay focused on something like that. You've got to have a deep connection to maintain that focus. And for all the rest of the masses, it's ABT. And so I don't know how much you want to get into this. We probably shouldn't too much, but sadly, the last presidential election was a case study in a non-narrative character running against a totally narrative character. And I saw this a year out because I was writing my book, and I wrote 5 different editorials that we tried, even working with the publicists at University of Chicago Press, tried to get them out there. But it was this ABT dynamic, and all I got thrown back at me is, it's not this simple. You know, this is for children. This is something we learned in grade school, yada, yada. Well, sorry. Right. Yeah, it is at some level.
Yeah. So you had an example we thought we'd run through, and then maybe we can see if there's some questions coming in too. Should I get to that example?
The ABT build?
Yeah, let me bring it up on screen.
And there's 2. So I wanted one that reflects our course that I'll just explain, because the problem is the one with you, Andy, is not science-based really. So, so this is one of the people in the course right now, the Fish and Wildlife Service. And what the course consists of is 2 things. It's the first half of every hour is cerebral. It's informational. It's a lecture from me for 25 minutes. The second half is visceral. It's training. And what we do in the second half of the hour is everybody at the start had to write their 1-sentence and but therefore description of a project they're involved with. They didn't get any coaching on it all. It was like, before they even pay their money or sign up, they had to write this thing off the top of their head. And so they're all filled with all kinds of shortcomings, but that's great. That's what we work on. And so each person eventually gets their 5 minutes in front of the whole class where they come on and they read their ABT. And I picked this one to share right now for a couple of reasons. First off, it's a good, short, concise one. Most of them end up being pretty lengthy, and that's one of the first things we work on. But this woman, Joanne Grady, last week, she read hers. And this was about the 7th or 8th session that we were in. And for the first time in the class, I stopped and asked her, if you were to revise this now before I start to critique it, what would you do? And the first thing she said was exactly what I had as my first note.
So before you go to your notes, let me just say it out loud. If anyone's watching on their phone, it's hard to read. Non-native, parenthesis, invasive species can damage the environment and economy, but people enjoy owning exotic pets. Therefore, we need to educate the public and provide take-back centers for unwanted pets to avoid their release into local environment.
Cool.
So that's so you said that was the result of a substantial amount of work.
Can you punch the button once?
Yep. Hold on.
There you go. And now punch it again, and then one more. Okay, so that's what we do. That's the color coding. So the setup, the and material, the agreement, this is how you begin communication, is through agreement before you get to the problem. And so there's your setup. Then the problem is stated in the but part, and then the third part is the consequence, the actions being taken. The interesting thing is that this is not a bad ABT. This is, everybody followed it. I'm sure it didn't bore you, didn't confuse you much. You kind of get the general idea, but this is what most people have, something in this neighborhood. But once you start to work on it, you begin to see that there's lots of fine scale stuff that can be made to make it more optimal, narratively stronger. And so, Andy, would you off the top of your head know what the first major revision to make on this thing would be?
Well, I would say something other than non-native invasive species. That would be the first thing I would.
Okay, cool. So you're going to content there. And what this is all about is form. Communication consists of two.
Yeah.
There's content and form. So this whole approach is mostly focusing. It's assuming that the person's facts are all accurate within this ABT as we work on it.
Okay.
And then focusing on form. A second chance, you want to make a note on form?
Oh, let me think here. Maybe, I'd get rid of that. We need to educate the public. And I'd say, therefore, we need to empower people to find, we need to help people. We need to help people find a way to switch their species preferences.
Okay. And this is cruel of me to subject to this because this
no, this is fun. Let's get it.
Okay. All right. So once again, what you're focusing on there is content. And so the reason that I chose this one, because this was a really heartwarming moment, which was that I put it to her and said, if you had the chance right now to revise this thing, she said, you know what, the red and the blue, I would flip them and now hit the button right there. This is my first note.
Okay.
Oh, how would you revise? I said, hit it again. There you go. Reverse the button. And so I already had this programmed in there as my note, and she got it before I even started to point it out. And that's exactly right. And it's so wonderful because there's no way she would have known this when she wrote it back in the beginning. That's why she wrote it this way. But after 6 or 7 sessions, she is beginning to develop narrative intuition, beginning to see, okay, wait a second. Look at what you've got there in the red. The red is actually the problem. The red is actually the setup there. And there's no problem inside of that. People enjoy owning pets. The blue is the statement of the problem, but non-native invasive species can damage the environment and the economy. And so that's the first major revision you'd make on this thing. And this ABT template tracks directly off of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. This idea that we go through 3 phases, which is the initial non-narrative phase, setting up the context of what we're going to talk about. Then you hit the problem, and that's the but word. And then you start this journey, which is that's where you've gotten into the narrative world. You've lit up the brain. And again, Yuri Hassan's work shows that when you hit that but, when you hit the problem, people's brains light up. That's the power of narrative. That's what you want to be tapping into as best as possible. And then once you establish the problem, then you want to advance the narrative and move on to the green thing. What are you going to do about it, actually? And let's see, I think that was, you want to hit the button once more. And so that's the idea of going from the ordinary world to the special world. And you want to maximize that contrast right there. You want to come off the blue material once you want it to be as peaceful, happy as possible. And then right on the word but, you want to have the maximum impact. And you do that by actually going right into a sort of summary statement first before you get into the details and behind the problem. And then the last little thing there, I think was one of the notes to her as well. Power of storytelling rests in the specifics. So I think we'd want more specifics. That's what I think you were pushing towards exactly how we're going to educate the public. What are the programs? More specific.
Well, but I guess my point was, I do think of it as a process point to see, it presumes you need to educate the public to get a policy change as opposed to other ways to enable the options. In other words, a bigger menu. So like if there's a store, if you go to a pet store and there's a place to drop off exotics or something like that.
Yes.
I just wonder, to me, that does feel like a process thing. Therefore, we need to, do we need to educate the public in order to have take back centers, for example, or just having the take back centers, does that provide a menu of opportunity, a menu of space that can get people to engage?
But you're getting to the bane of the entire environmental movement, is the endless tendency to go right to solutions without understanding that people don't see a problem. We just got through in the last hour, last session of Fish and Wildlife. My buddy Rick Nelson from North Dakota gave a whole presentation, a talk about, he brought me in for a problem. They had a huge problem there, which was in 2014, they put up a ballot initiative to try and get 5% of the oil and gas revenues from the state to go to conservation issues. And it failed miserably. They did a terrible communications campaign. They lost 80-20, just got pounded into the ground. Then he eventually brought me in with the camera crew to go around for a week around the state and try and figure out what in the world happened. And what we found out when we got out and talked to the average people was nobody felt there was a problem. The environmentalists had come out with, hey, we got the solution to all the conservation problems. And the average people said, we have no conservation problems here. People come from North Dakota or from North Carolina to North Dakota because we have so much wildlife here that we can hunt everywhere. And everybody in the country says, this place is overrun by what? We don't have any problems. Why would you offer up this solution? Happens all the time. You have to develop this intuition to begin with agreement, try and figure out what you've got in common with the opponents, then boil it down to clear, singular narrative that can embrace all the other agenda items you got. Then you get into the details of the agenda.
I guess that gets to that question of knowing who your audience, who is the desired audience. To some extent, that takes some research because you have to know the policy landscape around the particular question.
Definitely, you need that in order to get this structure. But the starting point is if you bypass the structure, which again, just going right to the problems, problems and solutions. In fact, with our story circles training starting 5 years ago in the beginning, we felt like, the and stuff, that's characteristic of boring everybody. And the more you can bypass that, it's the but and the therefore that are really powerful. But really, when you're working an agenda and you're wanting to make a difference, everything is in the blue material. It's how you frame this stuff. And one of the sad things was in 2004, George Lakoff came out with his Don't Think of an Elephant book and the idea of framing that took off as a big fad in the Democratic Party and everybody wanted to get into framing. But he didn't have an analytical way to approach it. And people didn't know what they were talking about. The ABT framework gives you this context where you can see this is what framing is. It's how you put together that blue material up front. And that makes all the difference. And this happens over and over again when people work on these ABTs in the course. The cool thing with the course is it's not so much your ABT that when we finally get to you doing yours, it's the 49 other ones that you sit through and get to watch these other people offering themselves up as guinea pigs. And it's the repetition over and over and over again. We went through 50 in that first course. And by the time you get to the 49th one, they get bored with me because they hear me pointing out the same things. There's about 7 to 10 major shortcomings that happen over and over again with these things, but they begin to develop the intuition that. And then should we go to the other one?
Yeah. Well, actually, there's some questions that came in that I think people are good. And also, I didn't know if there are other examples that you just have come to mind as you've been dealing with different agencies. If you could rattle off 2 or 3 that felt like the perfect kind of quick aha moment. But let me go to some of the questions because there are some good ones. And again, some of this will be more semantic, so it's a little less on structure. But Science Cathedral, whoever that is, says hello, thank you for being here. The educate the public sounds very elitist, condescending and dictatorial. Sounds like a person of privilege would speak. Again, I guess that I know you're into story versus. You used to speak of the sex appeal part of the storytelling as well. It's in your gut more than your brain. And I guess that gets at some of the other questions you've helped people explore in the past, which is not alienating your audience right away. Is there some thinking on that?
Oh, absolutely. I can't underscore how important the and is, and again, it's working with this stuff. In March, I had an article in Scientific American about the ABT as a tool for humanizing medicine. And there's age-old study in 1984, they did a study following doctors going on their rounds, and they timed them to see how much time they gave the patient once they said, "How are you feeling today?" At what point did the doctor interrupt the patient? Most people thought it might be 10 minutes or 5 minutes or something. When the study was done, it turned out the average time for a doctor to cut off the patient was 18 seconds. And that so shocked the medical community. Another study was done, and they found in their study 23 seconds. And that's the tendency to that's what you get when people are heavily educated. They're so caught up in their mind. They just like, I already know what I'm going to do with you. I don't want to have to listen to all your pleasantries from the day. And that has an effect in the effectiveness of medicine. If you let medicine become dehumanized like that, it's not nearly as effective. It's been the age-old challenge going all the way back to Sir William Osler. How do you humanize medicine? He's the guy that founded the residency programs in the medical world. And it's all in that and stuff, because there's where you humanize everything. That's where the humanities comes in. That's where the arts come in. And there's more art probably in that first element than there is in the but and the therefore are pretty objective. That's why scientists tend to be drawn right to that stuff. That's the easy part. Figuring out exactly how you open with the chemistry there to hold the interest of your audience is infinitely challenging. And that's where you avoid elitism, is by coming down to their level with and material that they actually connect with from the outset. Because if you don't connect at the beginning, you can't connect down the line.
That's for sure. And that's about the listening part of storytelling, no matter what story you're trying to tell. Yes. There was another question that came in. I thought, where is it? Oh, come on. I had it here a minute ago. We'll find it. So let's get back to what we were just talking about. You said I have a story that I've been thinking about.
Yes. Bring back the slides.
Yeah. Oh, hold on. Let me go back to them.
Yes. There we go. Okay, cool. Here, we're going to do the ABT exercise with you. So, Mr. Revkin, would you please read this for the class and click the button as you go along to have the color in there?
A suave young Russian scientist came to the U.S. in the 1980s to work on the science of nuclear winter, and he was working with top American scientists. But amid tensions over nuclear policy and spying, he vanished. Therefore, it's time to tell that story again. This is what it looked like in 1986.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
Back in the day when we had cigarette ads on the back of Science magazine. Speaking of complicating the narrative, that's the basic idea. Yeah, this 35 years ago, there's a lot of resonance. How do you capture the importance of that?
Okay, can you click the button 3 times to have the color in there?
1, 2, and 3.
All right, so there's the 3 parts there. So you're set up. It's about the scientist. Now, click it once more. And I'm going to do to you the terrible thing I do to a lot of these folks and give it one more click now. This is where you start this ABT build process. It all begins with the problem, the contradiction. That is where you draw in the audience. If you don't have that working properly, then you're never going to tap into narrative effectively. So it begins by defining what is your problem. So now let me ask you, in the light of this story, off the top of your head, without looking at the other screens, anything like that, tell me the sentence that begins with these 3 words. The problem is.
Well, the problem is no one wants to reveal the truth. He vanished. He's dead. Someone killed him. There was no body. The United States, it's not in their interests. Soviet Union, Russia's not in their interests. That's the real problem. That's the logistical problem in it. Figure out what happened.
Okay, but the problem of the narrative that you're wanting to tell.
Oh, the problem of that. Well, sorry.
Yeah, that sets up the therefore that you've got, because you've got a pretty explicit therefore, which is it's time to now tell the story. So the more that you can put together your narrative drawing on problem solution dynamics as opposed to just contradiction, the more powerful it is. And so lots of times people have these narratives. They're just like, here's 3 different events that went on. But really what we want is for you to set up something that's super valuable, that we love. It's all set in the world. And then in an instant, pull the rug out from under it and say, but there's a problem, which is it's about to go away. You get this one shot there on the butt. And if you can maximize the contrast there, that's your one chance to break through the noise and stimulate the brain of somebody. And if you just diffuse it out and put a whole bunch of words in there, you're never going to break through the noise. So this becomes really the defining moment, how you manage to do that. And that you do this not through dumbing down anything or through contriving anything or through lying like some people tend to do, some politicians, but that you do it by rearranging the information in the most effective, optimal form. And it turns out this stuff is super, super hard. It's the hardest part of communication. Ask those guys from South Park. They will tell you verbatim. It's the hardest part. So let's go a couple more clicks now. So we go back to your narrative and now one more click. And we've asked you, what is the problem? And one more click. Okay. Here's the fundamental thing. So all else equal in that blue material, there's 2 things you want to have in there. You want to begin with the ordinary world. What's this whole thing about? And then secondly, right there before the but, you want to tell us what's at stake. That's the place narratively, the optimal place for it is to make us really worked up about how important it is and then hit us with the impact of there being a problem with it. So what's at stake here? Why should we care? And even more importantly, because we got limited time, hit one more click, I think, on there. Okay. Why does the story need to be told? So you've ended there with your green part as it's time to tell the story. Why? That's what you've got. Right. Yeah, to begin with. So tell us, why does it need to be told?
Well, because scientists who model things as he did are increasingly caught in the crossfire, whether the issue is vaccination, climate change. If we let this case go, we're letting go the importance of science and the people who do it. They're getting ground up in the middle of pretty horrific fights that can actually, in this case, end a life. Yeah.
So, one of the age-old, and some famous quote from a famous novelist that said that when you finish a novel, the first thing you do is you throw away the first chapter and go back and rewrite the first chapter. And that's the basic dynamic, which is you don't know how to set something up until you're done sketching it out.
So that's the circle part of the circle part.
Well, that's what you want to do here is you've got a pretty clear, therefore, it's time to tell the story. You just haven't set it up, because I think that's actually, you want to reframe this, because I think the narrative you want to tell is that today we've got these dynamics going on with Russia, and these things are happening. And we're trying to motivate the public to understand how dire things are, but there's not enough powerful stories yet that have been told. Therefore, it's time to tell the story.
I like it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. You've hit on an important reality, and I think this goes for so many of the challenges that are in the news headlines right now. This idea of the consequence is a big deal, and especially, we can't end this without talking about where we are with vaccination or some of the other solution questions around the virus. Just today, the World Health Organization held a briefing on the infodemic, and they're convening until mid-July a big kind of expert committee. Talk about a nerd loop, Randy, to try to figure out what we know from science about how people react or don't react to information around this epidemic. This is one of the first times we've faced a problem, unlike global warming, where individual actions can actually really be part of the problem. If a community says, screw it, let's just go party and hang out and cough on each other, that can then ramify and spread and sustain the economic breakdown. So therefore, it feels like if we're not much more engaged in all of these questions, including the way you frame it, then we're really in deep doo-doo. I don't know if you feel.
Oh, absolutely. It's an utter and complete nightmare. And the science and medical worlds right now should be doing self-examination and admitting that they've failed drastically in the last 25 years. We've all got our different things that we point to. For starters, I point to Michael Crichton's keynote address to AAAS in 1999. In fact, my assistant, Matt, I think is listening in. Matt, can you try and find the link to that and maybe put it in the chat log if it's possible? But
I saw him earlier, yeah.
Crichton gave a blueprint in his AAAS speech that he gave in 99, right before he jumped ship and became part of the climate skeptic crowd. That speech has nothing to do with climate. It was him giving a final effort to try and help the science community by putting this stuff into narrative terms, into problem solution dynamics. And one of the key things he pointed to is this fundamental dilemma of the need for the singular narrative. And that's, his speech is so powerful. And then everybody also should read and reread the wonderful article from Nicholas Kristof in Outside Magazine in November of 2009. We use that endlessly in the workshops that I do. That I think word for word, there's no better essay ever written on broad communication for today's noise-saturated world, because he drew on social psychology literature for some of the things, and he talked about the patterns he had seen, he and his wife had seen in Africa. And it's in such simple and broad language that everybody can follow. But it's Nicholas Kristof's advice on how to save the world. And he gets into there the power and importance of the singular narrative. He tells about the idea that if you're doing this public education campaign and you're trying to motivate people by telling the story of one little girl in Africa, if you just make it two little girls, you already start to lose people. Right. Understanding the singular narrative is so difficult, especially to scientists who live their lives caught up in the idea of large sample sizes will save everything. But narrative is the opposite. Narrative is it's powerful, most powerful with the singular. And that's why you get anecdotes all the time, starting off stories. And the science world does not understand this. And where they missed out is the failure to have a singular voice. They got one opportunity with that, with what your governor did during, the worst months there, March and April. And I had a paper in MedPage, an article in MedPage, where I looked using these metrics we've derived from the ABT at Trump versus Cuomo. And you could see in the press conference they were doing that Trump, as we know, but this was a metric that could actually show you how unfocused and failing to tap into narrative Trump was as he wandered all over. Whereas Cuomo, those presentations he gave in March and April were unbelievably powerful in terms of using narrative structure. And whoever the team was that worked with him, were doing a brilliant job. The design of the slides, the delivery, everything. It really, the science world should study what Cuomo did back then. It's a real role model.
I'm sure they are. Although he's getting into heat, as everyone inevitably will for the resisting certain things early on. And that just shows you how this is not a one-shot deal either.
Yes.
If you're not sustaining your own vision and staying engaged with and listening, then you'll be flooded out by all the the social media landscape can kind of bury any narrative.
Well,
Matt, I just want to say, Matt David has been posting some links. I'm showing them here on screen. So everyone should know that this gets archived immediately, and you can scroll back to find these links and the like. So I'm not going to keep them on screen. And I do want to bring up a question that John Koifman brought up, who's a longtime professional environmental communicator. He says, for more than a decade, the message both to and from environmental comms folks has been to lead with solutions. And that was important when the bad habit of the community was focusing entirely on gloom and doom problems. But as Randy makes clear, there has been an overcorrection. Do you think, so where if you had that needle, there's no single needle, but if, let's just talk about climate change because it's more mature than talking about COVID-19, where no one really knows what to do. Where would you say the needle is? Is it still kind of just flickering all over the place, or are we settling into some new trajectory?
Some of these things, when you drive the bus into the ditch, you can't fix it overnight. When a movement goes off in the wrong direction, you can't, you come up with these ideas. One thing I will say, exactly what John has mentioned here, our good buddy, Nancy Knowlton, from the ocean conservation world in around 2005, she began to get tired of all the doom and gloom, literally, because her wonderful husband, I'm buddies with them for 40 years, and Jeremy Jackson was nicknamed Professor Doom and Gloom. And he's a tremendous storyteller and tremendous communicator. But as a result, when you're really powerful with communication, you're drawn to the contradiction, and you end up spending a lot of time with that because that is what cuts through the noise. And Nancy, really started to get her fill of that. So she got Jeremy working with her to begin a series of symposia called Beyond the Obituary. She said, I'm tired of all these doom and gloom stories in the oceans. From there, she morphed that into a hashtag, Ocean Optimism, which was let's focus on these success stories. And that turned out to be really popular on Twitter. And then she scaled that up in 2017 into her Earth Optimism Day. And I worked with her in the beginning there. We made a little video that was just used the ABT to address exactly what you've said here, John, which was the basic message of the video was we've had 45 Earth Days and they've accomplished a lot. Make no mistake, it's been really wonderful. But there's been a tendency to focus a little too much on the doom and gloom. Therefore, it's time to try and shift the course a little bit to a little bit of a tone of optimism. The tragic thing with that whole symposium was that she was set. Had there been a President Hillary, you would have all heard about Earth Optimism overnight there because it really was hitting the right note. Unfortunately, the other guy won, and instantly the whole mood changed, and it really was kind of out of sync in the spring of 2017. I took part in a huge thing. They ran the Ronald Reagan building there, about 200 or so speakers, I think. But then they ran it again this year for Earth Day. And Earth Optimism the second time through, and that's what you're clicking into there. So that's the beginnings of that, pushing in that direction. But still, what needs to get programmed into everybody is this structure of agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And to understand, one other resource is Jerry Graff's tremendous book, They Say, I Say. Matt, if you could post a link to that in there. So Jerry Graff is a good buddy of mine. He was in my movie Flock of Dodos, 2005, and he has spent a whole career arguing that the way we learn best is through argumentation, but that there's this set template for how you put together an argument most effectively, which is you begin with the other people, talking about, or everybody, what we can all agree on, then you go to the argument. The title of his book, They Say, I Say, which has sold over 2 million copies. It's a phenomenon in the humanities world. It's used in comparative literature and rhetoric and all these sorts of courses. And whenever I go and speak to a multidisciplinary audience at a university, I ask how many people read They Say, I Say. Not a single scientist hand goes up. Talk about the silo thing. You can see it right there. Ask scientists if they've ever heard They Say, I Say. There's complete obliviousness. And then you talk to humanities folks, and 2 million copies, Norton Press that published it, can't believe the success of it. And it's a short little book on the use of templates and argumentation. But the most important thing about it, more than all the content of the book, is just the title. They Say, I Say is the and the but. It's the agreement. It's the contradiction. It's what underpins all of this communication. So it's got to get somehow worked into the nature of the environmental movement. You can't get to the problems before you address something with agreement. You got to humanize this stuff.
And I think what you're getting at is, we disagree sometimes on some things, including the complexities out there.
Yes.
But I think we both agree that when you do the work of delineating arguments and stories, meaning nuclear folks or all renewable folks on climate change. Almost always you can find enough overlap to find the story that you can then apply your template to.
That's the idea. Agreement, contradiction, consequence. I mean, it derives from the 1600s. The philosophers, Kant and Hegel, all of them, the triad, thesis, antithesis, then synthesis. It somehow the postmodern teaching movement kicked that stuff out the door, and it never should have been, because it underpins everything. And regarding this idea of complicating the narrative, I'm fascinated with that whole topic. I'm intrigued to find out how they think that can possibly work, and how you can defy 4,000 years of evolution of the brain.
Some of what they are talking about, and this was the Solutions Journalism Network, Amanda Ripley, is literally as a journalist, how you apply your craft, how you handle an interview. There's actually interview techniques that come from mediators who ask questions that say yes and what do you mean? Or yes, let's dig a little deeper on that, as opposed to just being a journalist waiting there with your pad for the beautiful quote that fits your predisposed narrative. So it's not always, I think sometimes it gets misconstrued as, let's just tell a weird story that has tentacles in every direction and engages people in some way, because that's not a good, I think, not a positive path toward efficacy.
Yeah,
but there's a methodology to that, in a way, that can take you into finding the deeper meanings beyond the sound bites, for example.
Sure. But the difference is the power of the ABT is the sheer simplicity of it. That it's a tool to help you develop the intuition, and that's what's needed, is to intuitively. There's a question: is the setup, the agreement, the problem definition, or is an acknowledgement of status quo? Setup, the agreement, problem definition. No, the problem is in the red material. So the idea with the setup, if you take a look at Joseph Campbell's hero's journey model, the monomyth that he sketched out in the 1940s, which slowly Hollywood has come to understand in just the past 15 to 20 years, and they're still trying to figure these things out. The basic lineage is that Joseph Campbell sketched out the monomyth. George Lucas used it for the Star Wars franchise. Christopher Vogler wrote a book called The Writer's Journey, explaining to Hollywood the reason Star Wars resonated around the world was because it had this ageless underpinning. And then Robert McKee's book, he also talks about classical design. So these principles are hardwired into the brain going back thousands of years. We can see this. And all the information age has done is just throw a bunch of noise around them, but the brain still works the same way. And the three forces, that's where it matters: agreement, then contradiction. Contradiction is where you activate the brain. And if you never get to the contradiction, you're in the and thing, and you lose people. And I sat through a million talks from scientists over the years where they're up there and there's no narrative. It's just, here's a date on this and this and this and this happens. Nowadays, I get text messages all the time from friends, my old science colleagues, saying I'm stuck in the worst and presentation ever. And actually, one little piece of trivia I want to toss out to you, Andy, to show how new this stuff is and how important. If you were to look at really well-edited articles in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, New York Times, what would you expect to be the frequency in percentage as the number of words that are the word and, A-N-D? What percentage of all the words in a document well-edited would you expect that to be?
Percentage?
Yes.
Of total words.
Total words, exactly.
0.5%.
So this is what fascinates me. Is the idea, not just you, but every journalist I've tossed this out to, they don't have this. And I don't understand why this is not a giant number that is engraved in the brains of all journalists. And it will be someday, because we're moving more towards an analytical approach and metrics and things like that. But there was a study by the Stanford Literary Lab in 2015 where they looked at the annual reports of the World Bank, and they looked at the frequency of this word, and eventually they found their way to it. And in there, I read about, it turns out there's a very hard number there, 2.5%. And we went and did that. We gathered a whole bunch of articles from the New Yorker, the Atlantic, New York Times. And sure enough, they converge right around that. They're almost all, like 2.3 to 2.7 or so. The occasion there's an outlier, but it's absolutely a bell-shaped curve, right around 2.5%. And what the conclusion of the Stanford Literary Lab study was that the World Bank reports have drifted since the 1940s, when they were 2.5%, when they were well edited, Today, there are these giant committee things that now have over 5% as the score of the word and it means that this is reflective of non-critical thinking. When people are no longer shaping the narrative, putting in this effort, they just glue everything together with this word of agreement, and. And what they found was in these World Bank reports, there are major sections that completely contradict each other. They're just all glued together with the word and. So these metrics exist. They just have not been pursued.
So therefore, what's next? What's next? Obviously, people can go to your website.
Yeah.
Story Circles. Whoops, let me just put it on screen again. Storycirclestraining.com and learn more about the briefings and trainings you do. I'd like to think we might be able to create some enough momentum around your process to do a specialized seminar here within this community. People focused on this thriving online question I've posed here every Monday. And let's just dig in on that. So what can we do next? Where are you most? You're not as active on social media because you're focusing a lot on this now. What's the best place to follow you? Your active thinking.
You got the Twitter handle ABT Agenda at ABT Agenda.
Underscore, right? Or not underscore?
No, it's just at ABT Agenda.
That's right. Okay, because there is one out there. I think maybe I've gotten wrong in the past. Yeah. So ABT Agenda.
And that's my main social media thing. We could have a whole another hour about the fact that social media is largely non-narrative. There's a lot of problems with that. But yeah.
What do you think about Twitter threads and Twitter strings, some of which approach narrative quality? There was one, our first session here was Craig Spencer, who did basically to answer some friends on how you're doing. He's an ER doctor who was going crazy, the peak of the epidemic, the pandemic impact in New York City. And he did a Twitter thread that then became a Washington Post op-ed, that then became this incredible animated narrative animation of his view that no one could see because, it's in an emergency room in an ICU and hospital. And it felt like that gave some shape to tweeting. So is that a frontier, or is it just so transitory in environment generally that's not worth it?
In my book, Houston, We Have a Narrative, in one of the appendices, what happened was we began counting the number of characters in ABTs when we did our workshops, and people wrote an ABT without any guidance in advance. And it turns out that the average was right around 300 characters. So without any sort of people naturally write an ABT. So that's how many characters they need to be able to set up something, state the problem, and state the consequence. So that's putting things into their context and explaining the consequences. And back then, Twitter, remember, was only 140 characters. So in that appendix, I showed that and I said, one of two things are going to happen. Either this thing is going to go out of business because it's non-narrative, or it's going to have to expand. And sure enough, by 2017, they'd had enough misunderstandings, including the funny one with Stephen Colbert that I tell about in there, which again, his stuff was taken out of context, thrown onto Twitter without the context, all sorts of misunderstanding. And so in 2017, they doubled the length of the tweets. And it's better now, but it's still a largely non-narrative medium, and therein lie the problems. And so I, wrote blog posts and tried to publish editorials way back then saying, why would you allow the president, the most important diplomat in the country, non-narrative medium? Why haven't the Democrats been able to stand up to him? The only person who ever wrote an editorial I came across questioning that was Valerie Plame. She had a really good article a few years ago saying that. Is there some sacred rule that you can't stop the president from doing this? And there's such a lack of leadership in the Democratic Party. They're their own worst enemies for so much of this stuff. They sit and whine about how everything's gone wrong, but they've just had no direction and failed to stand up against these things. Tons and tons of stuff.
Well, there's a lot of work to be done. And what I love about the template, and I've used it teaching and talking to my son and thinking about stuff myself, is that as you try to, I think, instill in your story circles, you want it to become kind of a reflex. So it's kind of one of those reflexes in your toolkit. Like, do I click on this thing before I know it's real? That's a reflex. You have to pull back from social media and really think back about how you're approaching it. And thinking about story, thinking about how you construct an argument, it feels like a vital step. And I think you've done invaluable service in trying to bring this, normalize this. So Randy Olson, it was great to have you on here. There's a lot going on in the world, and you don't have to spend your time here. There's surfing too. So I hope you'll come back. There'll be questions afterwards, I'm sure, and we can think about where we go from here.
Can I make one final statement?
Of course.
This online course that we're doing right now, we use WebEx, but who knew? This is the best teaching experience in my entire 40 years of teaching. And I left my professorship because I really couldn't take the university setup. I couldn't take mercenary students saying, is this going to be an exam? Is this going to be an exam? This online thing is just wonderful. And everybody's there to learn. And this chat log that goes on during the whole session is tremendous. And the ABT build stuff. So this right now is the most fun I've ever had in all the stuff. It's like the big payoff at the end of this whole long journey. And we've got it booked all the way through, I think, till through October. It's just pure fun. And those ABT things, like we just did, the ABT build, it's like crossword puzzles. It's so fun. Every single one you put up there, it's a puzzle. You know, how are we going to solve this narrative and strengthen it? And there's a solution to every one of them. You just got to work on it and slowly figure out, you know, what you can tweak to get them in better shape. So it's so much fun. So yay.
Well, it's always fun to catch up with you. And now there's a big thunderstorm coming through here. So good timing. I'm just going to end by saying
dramatic.
Yeah, I know. It's actually really big. So let me just close with a little boilerplate. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. And right now, our great pause, our tough pause. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. And as Randy Olson just explained, there's great upside to it, not just the downside, if you put your mind to it and your heart to it. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, in about 10 seconds, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide, and get in touch with me about ideas. See the little scrolling bar at the bottom, ways to get in touch with me or with Randy. Randy Olson, thanks for being here today.
Thank you. You are the best, Andy. Good to catch up.
We're all working at it one day at a time. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.